The year was 1873, and the wind, sharp as a new knife, whipped through the dusty streets of Fairplay, Colorado. This wasn't a town for the faint of heart, but it was home to Sarah Miller. She lived in a small, neat cabin at the edge of town, her hands always busy with mending, baking, or tending her tiny garden. Sarah was a quiet woman, with eyes the color of summer sky and a smile that rarely reached her lips. Folks in Fairplay knew her as kind, always ready with a helping hand or a warm word, even if she didn't say much. Her husband, Jed Miller, was a different story entirely. Jed was a man built for the wide-open spaces and the shadows that came with them. He was tall, with a laugh that could fill a saloon and a temper that could empty one. His reputation preceded him like a thundercloud. Whispers followed him everywhere. Outlaw, bandit, a man on the wrong side of the law. He rode a fast horse, carried a shiny pistol, and was known for daring escapades that often left the local bank a little lighter and the stagecoach a lot emptier. Sarah never spoke of Jed's doings. When he was home, which wasn't often, she kept his clothes clean, his belly full, and her worries to herself. She loved him in her own way, a love born of shared hardship and a hope that he might one day change. But deep down, a knot of fear tightened in her stomach whenever Jed saddled his horse and rode off into the setting sun. She knew his life was a dangerous dance, and she, by simply being his wife, was caught in its steps. One crisp autumn morning, the usual calm of Fairplay was shattered. Shouts echoed through the streets. Horses galloped hard, and the clang of metal filled the air. Jed Miller, after months of dodging and running, had been caught. He was cornered in a saloon, guns blazing but outnumbered, and standing right beside him, holding a basket of fresh bread she'd just bought, was Sarah. Her sky-blue eyes widened in terror as lawmen swarmed. Their rifles pointed not just at Jed, but at her too. In the chaos, no one seemed to notice her basket falling, the warm bread tumbling onto the dusty ground. To the townsfolk, it looked as if she was part of it all, another outlaw caught in the net. The air thickened with gun smoke and the shouts of men. Jed, wild-eyed and defiant, was wrestled to the ground, his pistol kicked away. Sarah stood frozen, her mind reeling. She had only stepped into the saloon to ask Jed if he'd be home for supper, a simple, everyday thought that had turned into a nightmare. Now rough hands grabbed her arms. "Get her too," someone yelled, mistaking her shock for guilt. She was with him. Panic flared in Sarah's chest. "No, I didn't do anything," she cried, her voice thin against the din. But no one listened. The lawmen, tired from the long chase and keyed up from the fight, saw only the outlaw's wife, standing too close to the action. To them, she was just another piece of Jed's wicked world. Her protests were drowned out by the heavy boots of the deputies, the jingle of chains, and Jed's own furious curses as he was hauled away. Sheriff Thomas, a man with a stern face but kind eyes, watched the scene unfold. He knew Sarah. He'd seen her many times, quietly going about her chores, never causing trouble. He'd always thought it strange that such a gentle soul was tied to a man like Jed. But in the chaos of the moment, with the townsfolk gathered and muttering, even Sheriff Thomas couldn't argue against the immediate evidence. She was there right next to Jed when he was caught. It looked bad, very bad. They chained Sarah's wrists, the cold metal biting into her skin. Her legs felt weak, and her heart pounded like a trapped bird. She glanced at Jed, who was already being pushed toward a waiting wagon. He met her gaze, a flicker of something, regret, anger, in his eyes before he was shoved roughly inside. Sarah felt a wave of despair wash over her. She was innocent, yet she was being treated like a hardened criminal. The townsfolk, who had known her for years, now looked at her with suspicion, their faces grim and unforgiving. As she was led away, the whispers grew louder. "An outlaw's wife? What did you expect?" one woman muttered. "She must have known what he was doing," another added. Sarah's head drooped. The weight of their judgment was almost as heavy as the chains on her wrists. She was swept up in Jed's downfall, an innocent caught in a storm of someone else's making, her quiet life shattered in an instant. The path to the jail seemed endless, each step taking her further from the life she knew and closer to a fate she didn't deserve. The courtroom was packed, buzzing with hushed voices and shuffling feet. Every eye in fair play seemed to be fixed on the small, wooden dock where Sarah and Jed stood. Days had passed since their arrest, days that felt like years in the cold, damp jail cell. Sarah's hair was disheveled, her dress soiled, and her spirit felt as brittle as dry leaves. Jed, beside her, looked grim but unbroken, his gaze fixed straight ahead. The judge, a serious man with spectacles perched on his nose, read the charges: robbery, assault, and for Sarah, aiding and abetting. The words echoed in the silence, each one a hammer blow to Sarah's fading hope. Her lawyer, a young man who seemed overwhelmed by the town's prejudice, offered little defense for her. He spoke of her good character, of her quiet life, but his words were like pebbles dropped into a deep well, making little impact. Jed, when asked to speak, just scoffed. "Do what you gotta do," he mumbled, refusing to deny Sarah's involvement, refusing to clear her name. Sarah looked at him, a plea in her eyes, but he wouldn't meet her gaze. A wave of crushing despair washed over her. Even Jed, her own husband, wouldn't speak for her. Sheriff Thomas, sitting among the spectators, shifted uneasily. He had testified about finding Sarah near Jed, confirming her presence, but he also mentioned her shock and her cries of innocence. Still, the evidence against Jed was clear, and Sarah's proximity sealed her fate in the eyes of the law. He watched her, a deep frown etched on his face, a feeling of unease stirring in his gut. Finally, the judge cleared his throat. "Jedediah Miller and Sarah Miller," he began, his voice solemn. "For your crimes against the good people of this territory, it is the judgment of this court that you both be taken to the gallows and hanged by the neck until dead." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Some townsfolk nodded, their faces grimly satisfied. Justice, they believed, was being served. Others, particularly the women who knew Sarah's gentle ways, looked shocked, a few even shedding tears. Sarah herself swayed, her legs giving out. The world spun. She felt a cold hand on her arm, steadying her, but she barely noticed. The words "hanged by the neck until dead" rang in her ears, stealing her breath, stealing her future. Her innocence meant nothing. Her life, it seemed, was over. The morning of the execution dawned gray and cold, mirroring the dread in Sarah's heart. From her cell window, she could see it. The freshly built gallows, stark and ugly against the pale sky, standing tall in the center of Fair Play's dusty square. A crowd was already gathering, a silent, dark mass growing larger by the minute. The air hummed with a strange mix of morbid curiosity and somber expectation. Sarah felt numb. She had spent the night staring at the rough stone walls, trying to remember the warmth of her own bed, the smell of fresh bread from her oven. Now, all she could smell was the damp earth and the metallic tang of fear. A deputy brought her a simple, clean dress, of final kindness, perhaps. Her hands trembled as she put it on, each button feeling heavy as a stone. She thought of her mother, long gone, and wished for a moment of her gentle touch. Soon, the heavy iron door clanged open. Sheriff Thomas stood there, his face etched with a tiredness Sarah hadn't seen before. His gaze met hers, holding a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Pity? Doubt? He didn't speak, just nodded for her to come. Jed was already outside, his arms bound, his usual swagger replaced by a grin set to his jaw. As they walked through the jailhouse doors, the sounds of the town hit Sarah like a physical blow. The low murmur of the crowd, the creak of the gallows wood in the wind, the distant barking of a dog, all seemed to amplify her terror. She saw faces she knew. Mrs. Gable from the general store, old Mr. Henderson who ran the livery, even children peeking from behind their parents. Their expressions ranged from sorrow to stern judgment. No one smiled. No one offered a comforting look. The climb up the gallows steps felt endless. Each creaking board was a step closer to her unjust end. Her knees were weak, her breath shallow. When she reached the platform, The world seemed to shrink to the rough wood beneath her feet and the gaping hole of the trapdoor. A noose, thick and coarse, hung waiting. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. She was innocent, yet here she stood, about to pay the ultimate price for another's sins. The silence of the crowd pressed in, heavy and final, as the deputy moved to place the hood over her head. This was it. The deputy reached for the hood, his hand hovering over Sarah's head. Jed stood beside her, his own noose already in place, his face a mask of stone. Sarah closed her eyes, a silent prayer forming on her lips. She waited for the darkness, for the sudden drop, for the end. The silence of the crowd was absolute, a heavy blanket of anticipation. Then, a sharp, clear voice cut through the stillness. "Hold!" Sarah's eyes snapped open. Sheriff Thomas stood at the edge of the platform, his hand on his pistol, his gaze firm. The deputy paused, confused. The crowd stirred, a ripple of murmurs spreading. "Sheriff," the judge called out from below, his voice edged with impatience. Sheriff Thomas stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "I cannot let this happen," he declared, his voice ringing out across the square. "Jed Miller is guilty of his crimes, and he will face justice. But Sarah Miller is an innocent woman." A gasp went through the crowd. Jed, for the first time, looked surprised, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "She was caught by chance, standing in the wrong place at the wrong time," the sheriff continued, his voice gaining strength. "She has no blood on her hands, no stolen gold in her pockets. I have known Sarah Miller for years. She is a kind, honest woman. I will not stand by and watch her die for another's sins." With a swift, decisive movement, Sheriff Thomas drew his knife. Before anyone could react, he reached out and slashed through the rope around Sarah's neck. The coarse hemp fell to the platform with a soft thud. Sarah stared, bewildered, at the severed rope, then at the sheriff. "Sarah Miller, I declare you innocent," Sheriff Thomas announced, his voice booming. "And from this moment forward, you are under my protection." He took her arm, his grip firm but gentle, and led her away from the gaping trapdoor, away from the waiting noose. The crowd erupted into a confused roar. Some shouted in protest, others in stunned silence. But Sheriff Thomas didn't falter. He simply led Sarah down the steps, her legs trembling, away from the gallows and into an uncertain, but suddenly possible, future. Jed watched them go, his expression unreadable, as the deputy, after a long moment of shock, moved to prepare him for his own fate. The roar of the crowd followed Sarah and Sheriff Thomas as he guided her away from the gallows. It wasn't a roar of anger, not entirely, but one of utter shock and confusion. Never in Fairplay's history had such a thing happened. A condemned prisoner, freed at the last possible moment by the very lawman meant to ensure justice was served. Sarah felt like a ghost, walking beside the sheriff, her mind still trying to grasp what had just happened. The cold air felt sharper, the dusty ground beneath her feet more real. She could feel the stares, hundreds of eyes burning into her back, into Sheriff Thomas's back. The whispers began almost immediately, like a dry rustle of leaves in the wind. What in the blazes was that? Sheriff Thomas? He cut her down, but she was Jed Miller's wife. She must have known, taking her under his protection. What does that mean? The judge, red-faced and sputtering, was already making his way down from the platform, demanding answers. Sheriff Thomas, however, ignored him for the moment. He led Sarah directly to his office, a small, sturdy building next to the jail. He pushed open the door and gestured for her to enter. Inside, the silence was a welcome relief from the clamor outside. Sarah sank onto a wooden chair, her legs finally giving out. Sheriff Thomas closed the door, muffling the sounds of the protesting townsfolk. He turned to face her, his gaze kind but serious. "You're safe now, Sarah," he said, his voice low. "I truly believe you're innocent. But this won't be easy. Folks won't understand." He was right. Already, the whispers outside were growing louder, bolder. They weren't just about Sarah anymore. They were about him. Sheriff Thomas, gone soft? Taking up with an outlaw's widow. He must have a reason, a personal reason. The seeds of gossip, once planted, would sprout quickly in a small town like Fairplay. Sarah could feel it, the heavy weight of judgment settling over her once more, even though she was no longer condemned to death. Her life had been saved, but her reputation, she knew, was now hanging by an even thinner thread than her rope had been. The future felt less like a fresh start and more like stepping into a new kind of prison, built by wagging tongues and suspicious glances. Life under Sheriff Thomas's protection was not what Sarah expected. He gave her a small room in the back of his office, clean and simple, but it felt less like a home and more like a temporary shelter. The first few days, Sarah barely left it. The thought of stepping out into the street, into the stares and whispers, filled her with dread. She ate the meals the sheriff brought her, mostly in silence, her mind still reeling from the near-death experience and the sudden change in her life. Sheriff Thomas was kind, always respectful, but also very busy. He spent hours dealing with the fallout from his actions, answering to the judge and the town council. Sarah could hear the angry voices through the thin walls, the heated debates about whether he had overstepped his authority. Each raised voice was a fresh reminder of the town's disapproval, a constant weight on her shoulders. When she finally gathered the courage to venture out, it was only to fetch water from the well or to sit on the small porch of the office. Every time, she felt eyes on her. Women would pull their children closer. Men would stop their conversations, their gazes cold and judging. No one spoke to her, not a friendly greeting, not a simple nod. It was as if she were invisible, yet everyone saw her. One afternoon, she heard two women talking near the general store, their voices hushed but clear. Still living off the sheriff charity, that one sniffed. Probably got him wrapped around her little finger. The other chuckled. Or maybe it's more than charity, if you catch my meaning. Sarah's face burned. She quickly ducked back inside, tears stinging her eyes. She longed for her old life, her quiet cabin, her garden. But Jed's cabin had been ransacked by souvenir hunters after his hanging, leaving nothing but broken furniture and scattered memories. She had no home, no money, and no place in this town, save for the sheriff's reluctant protection. Adjusting was hard. She felt useless, a burden, and the constant scrutiny made her feel trapped, unable to breathe freely. The kindness of Sheriff Thomas was her only comfort, a small, steady light in the overwhelming darkness of her new reality. One crisp morning, Sarah decided she couldn't just sit and wait. She wouldn't let the whispers define her. Seeing the sheriff's office needed tidying, she started by sweeping the dusty floors and straightening the stacks of papers. It was a small act, but it brought a sense of purpose. Sheriff Thomas, noticing her efforts, simply nodded his thanks, a quiet appreciation that felt like a ray of sunshine. Soon, Sarah found other ways to be useful. She mended torn uniforms for the deputies, her nimble fingers working quickly and skillfully. She helped Mrs. Gable in the general store when the older woman twisted her ankle, restocking shelves and weighing flour with quiet efficiency. Mrs. Gable, at first hesitant, found herself relying on Sarah, and a grudging respect began to form. One cold afternoon, a settler's child fell ill with a fever. The doctor was out of town, and the parents were frantic. Sarah, remembering old family remedies, brewed a strong, bitter tea from herbs she recognized and stayed by the child's bedside, cooling their forehead with damp cloths. Slowly, the fever broke. The grateful parents, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, looked at Sarah with new eyes. They thanked her again and again, their whispers now about her healing touch, not her past. These small acts of kindness and hard work didn't change everyone's minds overnight. Many still eyed her with suspicion, still muttered behind their hands. But little by little, a few people started to see the real Sarah. The men at the saloon, who once joked about the outlaw's widow, began to notice the clean uniforms and the efficient way Sarah helped around town. The women who saw her care for the sick child started to wonder if they had been too quick to judge. Sheriff Thomas watched it all, a quiet satisfaction growing within him. He saw the shift, the slow turning of the tide. He knew it was hard for Sarah, but he also saw her strength, her quiet determination to prove her worth not with words, but with her actions. She was not just the outlaw's wife. She was Sarah, a woman of substance, slowly, patiently, earning her place back in the heart of fair play. Even as Sarah slowly earned the respect of a few, the old whispers persisted, especially from those who clung to their first judgments. Sheriff Thomas, however, was not one to stand idly by. He had seen Sarah's quiet strength, her tireless work, and her genuine kindness, and his admiration for her grew with each passing day. He knew she deserved better than the cruel gossip. One afternoon, in the dusty general store, Mrs. Henderson, a woman known for her sharp tongue, loudly remarked, "It's a wonder Sheriff Thomas hasn't sent that outlaw's widow packing. Some folks just don't know their place." Sheriff Thomas, who was buying supplies, turned slowly, his usually calm voice now edged with steel. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his gaze firm, "Sarah Miller has shown more courage and decency in these past weeks than many in this town have in a lifetime. She tended a little Jimmy Peterson when he was burning with fever, saving his life. She's mended clothes for half the deputies and helped Mrs. Gable when she was laid up. Her husband's sins are not hers, and I expect you to remember that." Mrs. Henderson's face flushed, and she quickly busied herself with rearranging a pile of fabrics. The store fell silent. This wasn't the first time Sheriff Thomas had stepped in. He had a way of quashing gossip with a quiet word or a stern look, his authority undeniable. He defended Sarah not just because he believed in her innocence, but because he saw her true character shine through the hardship. Later that week, a group of men in the saloon were grumbling about Sarah still being in town. "Sheriff's got a soft spot, that's what it is," one slurred. Thomas, who had just walked in, slammed his hand on the bar. The glasses rattled. "My soft spot, as you call it, is for justice and for folks who earn their keep honestly," he declared, his eyes sweeping over them. "Sarah Miller has done nothing but that. Any man who says otherwise will answer to me, personally." His words carried weight. The men quieted, knowing the sheriff meant what he said. Sarah, who often tried to make herself small and unnoticed, felt a surge of warmth and gratitude whenever she heard of his defense. His unwavering belief in her, his readiness to stand up for her, slowly began to mend the deep wounds left by the town's judgment. She realized she wasn't just under his protection. She was under his steadfast care, and that meant more than words could say. The real test of Sarah's place in fair play came on a scorching summer afternoon. A fire broke out at the livery stable, a roaring inferno fed by dry hay and wooden stalls. Horses whinnied in terror, trapped inside, and the flames threatened to leap to the neighboring buildings. Panic gripped the town. Men rushed with buckets, but the fire was too fierce, too fast. Sheriff Thomas was organizing the bucket line, shouting orders, but the stable owner, old Mr. Henderson, was distraught, trying to break through the burning door to save his prize mare. The heat was unbearable, and thick smoke filled the air. No one dared go near the stable. Suddenly, Sarah, who had been helping direct people away from the danger, noticed something. A small, often overlooked side door at the back of the stable, usually used for feed deliveries, was still intact. It was hidden by some barrels, but she knew it was there from her days of buying feed for Jed's horses. Without a moment's hesitation, she grabbed a wet blanket, wrapped it around herself, and ran towards the back. "Sarah, no," Sheriff Thomas yelled, seeing her dash into the smoke. Ignoring him, Sarah pushed aside the barrels, found the latch, and wrestled the heavy door open. Smoke billowed out, but she could hear the terrified snorts of the horses. "Come on," she called, her voice surprisingly strong. "Come on, girls." She slapped the first horse's flank, guiding it out. One by one, 4 horses, including Mr. Henderson's mare, stumbled out into the fresh air, coughing but safe. When Sarah emerged, soot-stained and breathless but unharmed, a hush fell over the crowd. Then, a cheer erupted, starting with Mr. Henderson, who rushed to embrace his mare, and then Sarah. "You saved them. You saved my horses, Sarah," he cried, tears streaming down his sooty face. The cheers grew louder, spreading through the crowd. People who had once whispered about her now clapped and shouted her name. Mrs. Henderson, who had so recently spoken ill of her, simply stared, her mouth agape. Sheriff Thomas rushed to her, his face a mix of relief and pride. "That was incredibly brave, Sarah," he said, his hand gently touching her arm. In that moment, standing amidst the smoke and the relieved townsfolk, Sarah's place in fair play was no longer questioned. Her quick thinking and courage had not only saved valuable animals, but had also solidified her worth in the eyes of almost everyone, finally silencing her most persistent critics. She was no longer just Jed Miller's widow. She was fair play's hero. After the livery stable fire, the air around Sarah felt lighter, the stares less harsh. But it was in the quiet moments that the true change happened between her and Sheriff Thomas. Their conversations grew longer, stretching past simple courtesies to shared thoughts about the town, its people, and the challenges they faced. He saw her wisdom, her quiet understanding of human nature, and she saw his unwavering sense of justice, his deep care for fair play. One evening, after a long day, Sheriff Thomas found Sarah sitting on the porch of his office, watching the stars. He joined her, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while. "You know," he said, breaking the quiet, "I never doubted your goodness, Sarah. Not truly, even when everyone else did." Sarah turned to him, her eyes soft in the dim light. "I know," she replied, a gentle smile gracing her lips. "And that meant more than you could ever imagine. You saved my life, Thomas, in more ways than one." He looked at her then, not as the outlaw's widow, nor as the woman he had saved, but as Sarah, a woman of remarkable resilience and grace. The respect he had always held for her deepened, growing into a tender affection he hadn't expected. He found himself looking forward to seeing her each day, to their quiet talks, to the way she brought a gentle order to his often chaotic life. Sarah, too, felt a new warmth bloom in her heart. Thomas was steady, kind, and strong. He had stood by her when no one else would, facing down the entire town for her. She admired his courage, his unwavering moral compass. His presence felt like a safe harbor after a terrible storm. The fear and despair that had clung to her for so long slowly began to fade, replaced by a quiet hope. Their bond wasn't a sudden, fiery passion, but a slow, steady burn built on shared trials and deep respect. The challenges they had faced together, the town's judgment, the near-death experience, had forged a connection between them that was strong and true. They had found solace and strength in each other, two quiet souls who had weathered a storm and found an unexpected calm in its aftermath. The affection between them was clear, unspoken yet understood, a quiet promise of a future that once seemed impossible. The day Sarah Miller and Sheriff Thomas were to be married was a bright, clear morning, a stark contrast to the grim day Sarah had once faced on the gallows. The little church in Fair Play was filled to bursting, not with whispers of judgment, but with cheerful chatter and happy anticipation. Every face in the crowd, from Mrs. Henderson to old Mr. Henderson and the Petersons, held a warm smile for Sarah. She was no longer an outcast, no longer just Jed Miller's widow. She was Sarah, the kind, brave woman who had earned her place in their hearts. Sarah walked down the aisle, not in a fancy white gown, but in a simple, beautiful dress sewn by Mrs. Gable herself. Her eyes, once filled with despair, now sparkled with joy. Waiting for her at the altar, looking handsome and proud, was Sheriff Thomas. He extended his hand, and she took it, her fingers intertwining with his, a silent promise exchanged between them. The preacher's words were warm and sincere, speaking of love, loyalty, and the strength found in overcoming hardship. As they exchanged their vows, promising to stand by each other through all of life's challenges, a hush fell over the church, a shared feeling of happiness for the couple who had found love in such an unexpected way. Then came a moment that brought tears to many eyes. As the ceremony ended, Sheriff Thomas reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out his shining badge, the silver glinting in the sunlight, streaming through the church window. With a gentle smile, he pinned it carefully onto Sarah's dress, right over her heart. "You've shown me what true courage and justice look like, Sarah," he said, his voice soft but clear for all to hear. "You wear this not just as my wife, but as a partner in all things, a symbol of the justice you embody." Sarah looked down at the badge, then up at Thomas, her eyes brimming with love and pride. The badge, once a symbol of the law that had almost taken her life, was now a symbol of their shared future, a future built on love, respect, and the quiet strength of a woman who had faced death and found new life. A cheer erupted from the congregation as Thomas kissed his new wife, and Sarah, the former outlaw's widow, stood tall, the sheriff's badge shining brightly on her chest, finally home.